release of the Lockerbie bomber Abdel Basit al-Megrahi from prison in Scotland in 2009. Well, let's go to Westminster and speak to our chief political correspondent, Laura Kuenssberg. And Laura, take us through it.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Well, it is a long report, some 150 pages of evidence and conclusions from Sir Gus O'Donnell, the country's top civil servant. So I am just going to go through to some of the key points. So forgive me for some of the details here. We are just digesting what has been published. But in summary, Sir Gus O'Donnell says none of the materials that he has reviewed contradicted anything the previous Foreign Secretary David Miliband or the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown said. What he does say is that Libya made explicit a link between their commercial interests and what they wanted the UK and Scottish government to do about Libyan prisoners. So the link between particularly BP, British Petroleum, and a major oil deal was made by Libya in their dealings with the UK government. He says it's clear that BP were involved in lobbying about a prisoner deal and the UK government's decision about whether or not Abdel Basit al-Megrahi could be included in any mechanism, what was known as prisoner transfer release. And he also says that UK ministers did discuss big deals like that of BP in relation to what was happening with that deal between Libyan prisoners. He also says, however, throughout all of that process, Scottish ministers who would make the ultimate decision were clear that they would have a final veto, and there was no question that the UK government said anything else to Libya. Indeed, the report goes on to say that UK ministers made it adamantly clear at all stages to Libya that the final decision would be taken by ministers, not here, but in Edinburgh, 400 miles away. He also says that there's no evidence that BP pressured the Scottish government. So while BP was talking to the UK government here in Westminster and linking the idea of prisoners and commercial deals, they were not themselves pressuring the government in Holyrood. Again, he says, and it's interesting in the report how much he goes to emphasise this, is that it was clear all along that the release in the end or not would be decided by the Scottish government. But, and this is I think the most interesting bit, Sir Gus O'Donnell concludes that it was clear that the underlying wish of the UK government here in Westminster was that Abdel Basit al-Megrahi would go home to die. Not that he would stay in a Scottish prison as others wanted, but that he would go home to Libya, and that was the view of UK ministers. Now that is significant because at the time all UK government ministers would say is that this was a decision for Scotland, it was not a decision for them to take. What these documents this afternoon show is that their policy behind the scenes was being developed to try to help Libya with their request to the Scottish authorities to have him released, and it was the wish of senior UK government ministers that Abdel Basit al-Megrahi, the only person ever convicted of the Lockerbie bombing, would go home to die. Controversial, of course, because the expectation was he would only live a few months after he went back to Libya, but 18 months on, he is still alive and living freely in his home country.
Laura, we know, of course, the Americans were very, very angry at this decision and how it was made. And when you point up that particular phrase that the UK government did all it could, that would seem to suggest to fall into some of that criticism the Americans had been making. But the critical point is, despite that, despite doing all they could, it's whether they put any pressure on the Scottish executive. And there's nothing in this report that suggests that that final link in the chain was made.
Yes, there is no silver bullet, there is no one piece of evidence, and it is not the view of Sir Gus O'Donnell, having reviewed all of the paperwork, that there was pressure put on the Scottish government by ministers here in London. And in fact, he says there was an understanding by UK government ministers that it might actually have been counterproductive to do so. Perhaps such is the fraught nature of politics between Westminster and Holyrood, that Westminster government members believed that if they were to try to interfere, well, that might work against what they were trying to achieve. But what is clear, though, is that they were doing a lot behind the scenes to facilitate, to help, to make sure that the Libyans had all the information about how they might go about it, all the information about how they might appeal to the Scottish government, to make their appeal to Edinburgh more likely to be won out. But on that specific point about whether or not the former Prime Minister or former Foreign Secretary pressured Alex Salmond, the First Minister, there is nothing that Sir Gus O'Donnell says that believes that suggest that that is true.
Laura, we've had this report, we're going to get documents published. In your view, is this the end of it?
I don't think this fundamentally changes the bare bones of this controversy. However, I do think this will continue to be an issue that enrages some people, alarms some people, and it's perhaps one of those issues, Matthew, where people believe what they believe about the release of Abdel Basset al-Megrahi. People have had very strongly held views on this issue since he was released in the summer of 2009, particularly on the other side of the Atlantic. There was real anger when he was greeted at home like a hero. Just this weekend, the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and David Cameron reminded people of their anger at the release by putting out a statement when they were together at a conference in Germany. And I expect that the Prime Minister this afternoon might have some words of attack for how the former government handled all of this. It will be very interesting to see his tone when he makes a statement to the Commons at 3:30 this afternoon. Even before he gets up on his feet, it is worth remarking the Prime Minister does not have to make this statement himself this afternoon. And the fact that he's chosen to do so, well, that's a political statement in its own.
Thanks very much for that. More from Laura through the course of this afternoon, 3:30, as she was saying. We're going to get that statement from David Cameron because, of course, we know that those documents, about 150 documents, are also have been published, and also that report that Laura was taking us through. We hope to speak to Alex Salmond here on that story in the next few minutes.